Recording in progress.
Good afternoon. My name is Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press, and I'll be moderating today's press conference. I unfortunately do not have a speakers list, so I'm going to let you introduce yourselves as you speak, and then we'll take questions from the room first. If you are on Zoom and you would like a question, please use the raise hand function.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Vecchio. I'm the Member of Parliament for Elgin Middlesex London and the Chair of the Status Women Committee. Today I am sitting with members of the committee. To the far end, I have Leah Gazan. Next, from the NDP, next on the block, Adrienne LaRouche. Beside me, Sonia Sidhu. And then to my left, Michelle Ferry. In 2019, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls concluded that the resource development projects can exacerbate the problem of violence against Indigenous women and girls. In its final report, the National Inquiry issued 5 calls for justice aimed at eliminating violence against Indigenous women and girls, specifically caused or intensified by resource extraction and development projects. To ensure that resource development projects in Canada are conducted in environments that are free from violence, and to respond for calls of justice 13.1 to 13.5 of the National Inquiry to the House Inquiry of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women, we studied this issue. The main findings: over the course of its study, the committee heard that resource development projects can often put Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited individuals at risk of experiencing gender-based violence. The report tabled today highlights some of the ways Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited individuals can be protected against those unintended human rights violations. Resource development in Canada must be done respecting the rights of Indigenous people. Projects must not go forward without the free, prior, and informed consent of affected Indigenous peoples and communities. In addition to providing their free, prior, and informed consent, Indigenous peoples and communities must be meaningfully consulted at all stages of the project development. The committee's report also notes that resource development companies must be held accountable for their projects' impacts on Indigenous lands, waters, and communities. This can be done by requiring companies to establish workplace safety plans and policies, and to track and report incidents of gender-based violence. Companies must educate workers about gender-based and sexual violence, cultural safety, and effects of colonization to Indigenous peoples. Our main recommendations. In its report, the committee put forward 15 recommendations and 1 observation to improve Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited individuals' safety and security. In particular, the committee recommends that the Government of Canada ensure the full implementation of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under Canadian law, and that resource development in Canada is grounded in its declaration. As well, the committee recommends that the Government of Canada implement all calls for justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls that are directed to the federal government, and that the committee also recommends that the Government of Canada ensure that all culturally relevant Gender-Based Analysis Plus is undertaken by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada in each natural resource development project review, with the goal of informing decision-making and identifying mitigation measures, and could be implemented to prevent violence against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited individuals for approved projects. As I said, we are so proud of the work that we have done at the Status of Women Committee. Just minutes ago, I was able to table a unanimous report from the Status of Women Committee with all 11 members signing on. I would like to introduce to you my colleague and Vice Chair of the committee, Ms. Sonia Sidhu, for her words.
Status of Women Committee and a Member of Parliament from Brampton South. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin people. I would like to express my condolences to the family and communities of the 4 Indigenous women tragically lost in Winnipeg. After hearing more than 70 witnesses in FIBO, I also want to thank MP Leah Gazan for her tireless work, and also want to thank Chair Karen McHugh and the whole FIBO committee. It's unanimously, we did the work and then gave the recommendation. And also thank the witnesses who appeared and everyone that submitted a written brief. Thank you for sharing your lived experience. As Chair said, we tabled the report, but we must continue to listen and consult, as this is just the beginning. We must all commit to deliver justice for those who have faced violence and those who have lost their lives. I'm extremely proud of the work that our committee has been done and we continue to do. Together we'll continue to take action so that all women, girls, and diverse gendered people can live free from violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to introduce to you Vice Chair from the Bloc, Adrienne LaRoche. Adrienne?
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Et je suis ici vraiment en solidarité avec les femmes et les filles autochtones qui encore aujourd'hui, malheureusement, un peu partout à travers le pays, en fait, vivent beaucoup de discrimination, d'injustice et d'inégalité. Et c'est ce sur quoi cette étude a tenté de se pencher. Donc, et tout comme mes collègues précédentes, je vais aussi ajouter ma voix. On a eu un débat d'urgence à la Chambre des communes pour rendre aussi nos condoléances aux proches de ces femmes disparues tragiquement à Winnipeg. C'est toujours d'une énorme tristesse lorsqu'on apprend ce genre de nouvelles. Et pour moi, c'était donc tout à fait naturel d'être présente ici et en remerciement aussi au travail qu'on a fait d'une façon unanime au comité de la condition féminine, de cette étude apportée par Lee pour ton travail et de voir à quel point est-ce qu'on a pu faire avancer cet enjeu-là d'une façon transpartisane, sans partisanerie. C'était vraiment important. C'est un enjeu sensible. Et de tout temps, j'espère maintenant que notre rapport sera utilisé. J'espère maintenant qu'il y aura la volonté politique de mettre en application, parce que des recommandations, il y en a déjà qui sont connues. Donc, j'espère que l'on pourra mettre de l'avant les appels. En fait, c'est les appels à la justice de l'enquête nationale sur les femmes et les filles autochtones disparues et assassinées. Et j'espère aussi, parce que le Bloc est également tout à fait d'accord qu'on doit appliquer intégralement la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones pour un meilleur dialogue de nation à nation. Et je le répète, en solidarité avec les femmes et les filles autochtones. Et pour qu'il n'y en ait pas une de plus qui soit disparue et assassinée. Merci.
Thank you very much. I would like now to pass it on to MP Leah Gazan from Winnipeg Centre and the member of the NDP on our committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I first want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples, and to say how powerful it is that in light of the ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls, that our committee was able to work together unanimously to send a clear message that violence against all women, including the kinds of violence being endured by Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people who are residing particularly close to resource extraction, must end. And our committee has provided a very clear recommendations that were developed in response to calls for justice 13.1 to 13.5. I really appreciate my colleagues today mentioning once again the loss of life of Indigenous women and girls in Winnipeg, the lack of action, the kind of lack of action that causes great despair amongst Indigenous peoples across Canada. And I think this is a good example that when there is political will and when we work together, we can make a difference. We have provided very clear recommendations in this report, including, as our good chair has mentioned, to lift up UNDRIP, including ensuring the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, holding companies to account so that should they choose to extract resources on our lands, that women, girls, and Two-Spirit are safe. This study wasn't about whether we agree with resource extraction or not. We have different opinions on that, but one thing we agree on unanimously is that we must have zero tolerance and must stand united against violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit peoples across the country. And I have to say, in this place, being an Indigenous woman, there's very few places where you really see your voice being heard. And I have to say, in this committee and for this study, it was extremely powerful that people from different parties, from all different political stripes, were able to work together to fight for justice for Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit. And I hope that these recommendations are taken seriously. I hope that these recommendations are useful for those in the field fighting to end this ongoing genocide. And I just want to lift up everybody on the committee for our work, for our solidarity, and I really hope that this report makes the difference that is so needed immediately. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start with questions in the room, and we'll start with Stephanie Taylor from the Canadian Press.
Okay, thank you, Mia. I'm just question for Michelle or Karen as well. The Conservatives talk a lot about the benefit of resource development and resource extraction and what it can bring to communities. But some of the recommendations here in terms of getting the government to make sure companies have mandatory training are held and that they are held account might be seen within the business community, others as additional regulations or additional things for companies in an already tight market and tight space to take on. How have you kind of reconciled the recommendation between asking companies to kind of do more in this space?
I'm going to pass it over since I'm acting as chair at this moment.
Thanks for the question, Stephanie. You know, we know that resource extraction is the #1 employer. So, and I think to my colleagues' comments, this isn't about whether or not resource extraction is good or bad. We do have different opinions on that. But I think we all agree that education and consultation and protecting people is at the core of it. And I don't know any businesses or corporate responsibility that wouldn't want to be a part of that. So I don't see that there's really anything to reconcile. We want to keep people safe, and in particular in this study, Indigenous women and their families.
I guess as a follow-up, how would you, and this is for anyone on the committee, how would you respond to companies that might hear the news from today and say, whoa, we don't have the capacity to do mandatory training, or no, this is more resources we don't have, or some kind of response to this? How would you reply to companies who say, we already do plenty, we just don't have the capacity to do more?
I can respond to that. These are human rights matters. Certainly parliamentarians and companies are required to uphold human rights in this country. In the last parliament, we passed Bill C-15, and although the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples already, had application in Canadian law, companies or anybody working in any community has an obligation to uphold human rights. That includes the human rights of Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit. We found through the study that is not happening in many cases, and our committee has said, if you choose to do that, like anybody else, you have to make it sure it's safe for a community. I don't know any community that would allow any sort of development if it impacted the safety of their community. That's something we all agree on this committee, that there has to be zero tolerance in all cases of gender-based violence, and that also includes with Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit located by resource extraction.
Fraser Needham, APTN.
Yeah, thank you. This is also for the, I guess, the Conservative MP on the committee that's allowed to answer questions under the protocol.
I just don't want to take away from my. It's
Right.
up to
Oh,
these
sure.
ladies. I'm just.
Yeah, I'm
wearing both hats.
more interested. Same kind of that's where Stephanie's coming from. That I noticed that there's been a lot of talk about the UNDRIP. It's mentioned in this report, but I know the parties in Parliament have had very different stances on this document. And one of the things that communities that we report to say the problem is that often mining companies don't abide by a particular part of the UNDRIP, which is free, prior, informed consent. This leads to problems of exploitation in the community, including women. I guess for either of you, what would you say that means to your party, or to? I'll just leave it there.
Well, as you're looking at me, I'll just ask if you guys are all good, if I'm taking off my chair's hat and acting as Karen, all good? Okay, so thanks very much. Something for me, it is any time that we're looking at violence, I have no holds bar. That a violent-free Canada, a violent-free community is exactly where we need to go. So with all the questions that you're asking about UNDRIP, I recognize where you're coming, but I look at this very specifically, that when it comes regarding the violence, that there has to be a no-holds bar, that we cannot allow this to happen. When we're talking about some of these free, prior, and informed consent, we know that some of these issues are those concerns. We need to continue to work, and that's part of the Truth and Reconciliation as we're moving forward through this journey. It's not perfect yet, but we need to continue to make strides to work and find reconciliation. Do you have any additional thoughts?
I actually think your answer is what you're looking at. It's a united group of all parties who've said this is important. And I think that's your answer. I think corporate responsibility, and to Leah's point, this is human resources at the end of the day. And so if a company doesn't want to do their due diligence of ensuring safety, well, maybe they shouldn't be operating, right? I think that's the reality. But I think the point is that we're all here, we're all on the same page, and we believe in what we've put forth in recommendations.
Do have a follow-up, and it's also for the Conservative members, and that's also, as you know, these are complex issues with resources, right, and not just human resources, but actual resources in many of the Western provinces, of course, that you have provincial colleagues in that. So I guess, what would the federal government's role be? It mentions provincial rights too in the document, and in terms of where the committee or the federal government or this united committee feels if perhaps a province is allowing a company to pursue projects that are not in line with protecting women, Indigenous women in some of these areas. What would their role be?
Well, I think it's very, very clear what the role of Canadians has become, that I do believe that as you're standing together, shoulder to shoulder with people from the Indigenous communities, that part of this is part of reconciliation, that we all own it, that there is part of ownership, and that when you're asking what Canadians think, I think we need to look at the big picture, that we recognize that the part of the Truth and Reconciliation is understanding what has happened in the past and how we're going to move forward. So your question there for me is it is about moving forward, sir. That's the way I see it. It's that this is what we've talked about. This is what we're uncovering. We've heard what's happened last week. We just cannot allow these types of things to continue to happen. And that is part of the overall picture and how we should be dealing with these issues.
And may I add something? I just want to totally agree with my colleague. There should be zero tolerance, and we did all unanimously beside the partisan, we all came together. So that is why the recommendations there, and the government is committed to do, and we'll continue to do that work. So there should be no violence, no women and girls, except for what happened in the last week in Manitoba. So that is why we all worked together and made the recommendation.
Brett Forrester, CBC.
Je veux juste compléter, parce qu'on vient d'ouvrir la voie, quand on parle évidemment vous l'avez nommé, mais je tiens quand même à souligner que dans le document, nos recommandations vont être pour une consultation, une collaboration entre les communautés autochtones, les provinces, les territoires, le Québec. Donc, on parle de respect de compétences aussi. Donc, pour qu'il y ait un dialogue, mais que chacun puisse aussi respecter ses champs de compétences. Et ça, on s'est assuré que dans le document, ce soit là aussi pour qu'on travaille vraiment en collaboration avec les différents paliers de gouvernement, avec tout le monde. En fait, respecte aussi ses champs de compétences.
Okay, go ahead, Brett.
I'll just put this question out there for whoever wants to answer it. Resource extraction is usually done by private sector entities and is usually provincially regulated and provincially permitted. So what tools, levers, or measures do the feds have that can actually require these companies to do the sorts of things this report asks?
I can answer that. Yep. Is that
please.
Okay? So I think, I mean, we're talking about companies, but we also have treaties in this country. You know, if you look at even treaties in Canada, those were signed with the Crown. So I think it supersedes just what corporations do. This impacts all levels of government. If you look at much of the resource extraction that's happening around the country, it involves different levels of government. And I would say part of that as well are Indigenous peoples who have rights, rights that have been affirmed in the Canadian Constitution, a Canadian Constitution that members of Parliament have taken an oath to uphold. And that also includes what happens on Indigenous lands and territories, with Indigenous lands and territories and resources. Certainly, I think we all agree the privileges of companies do not supersede human rights. That includes Indigenous human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples. And I think the report certainly reflects that. An effort for across party lines. These are not easy discussions. I think we can see that in the press conference today. But I think at the end of the day, you know, we managed to come up with very clear recommendations that we agreed upon unanimously, and that I hope the government of the day will lift up those human rights and push for change, particularly in light of the fact that we have 231 calls for justice. We have slow movement on them, as we saw in Winnipeg last week. This is a crisis, and we need to aggressively deal with it. That certainly was agreed upon on this committee, and you know, by women from all different parties. And I think this is a really, really monumental day. Thank you.
And as a follow-up, again, just generally for whoever wants to answer it, speaking of corporations, some industry spokespeople have pushed back against the assertions that these work camps or man camps are kind of breeding grounds for predators, crime, and violence. They say that these camps are also filled with, you know, men with families and daughters who are just there to work hard. How does your report address that argument?
I'll come out of the gate with this one. And you know, that is some of the discussion, that idea of man camps. Yeah, a lot of times people are pushing back on that. You're absolutely right. But you have to understand that when you're bringing people into larger communities where there's not the resources available, you know, you might be putting in 1,000 people into a community that has maybe 40 or 50 people that live there. They don't have the resources in their communities. If you're not preparing, there will be problems, and that's what we've seen. I'm going to pass this over to my colleagues, because that is a huge discussion that we had throughout this entire piece. What does that really look like, and why does this happen? But there's multiple reasons, and a lot has to do with just all being new and how we change that. So I'll pass it over to my colleagues on this.
So I mean, I'm sure it's true. I'm sure there's lots of people with families and go there and work. I certainly, don't criticize that at all. But the reality is, and what research has shown, and certainly what was very clear that came out in the research and the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, is that there is a crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit that is elevated for Indigenous women and girls that live around resource extraction projects. Certainly that is a national inquiry that provided 231 calls for justice. This particularly report is to respond to calls to justice between 13.1 and 13.15. That is what this report is about, and certainly heeding the call for justice to actually do research, parliamentary research, to look into recommendations to address it at our level. We have done that. And, I think the research is clear, and we have to go with the facts. And that's exactly what the report did. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions on the line? If you're on Zoom and you want a question, please use the raise hand function right now. I don't see any at the moment. So I guess that concludes today's press conference. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everyone.